In July 1914, Britain made a decision that would ultimately destroy everything it had spent 3 centuries building. It entered a war that nobody truly understood, a war that would cost more than anyone imagined, a war that would fundamentally break the economic engine that made Britain the most powerful nation on Earth. And here's what terrifies me. America made the exact same decision in 2001, and we are now living through the slow-motion collapse that always follows. Let me show you something that will change how you see everything happening right now. Before I continue, if you want to understand where this country is actually heading, you need to subscribe to this channel right now, because what I am about to explain is not being discussed anywhere else. Hit that subscribe button because by the end of this video, you will see 2026 completely differently. Here is what they never taught you in history class. Britain did not fall because it lost World War II. Britain did not fall because of bad leadership or bad luck. Britain fell because in August 1914, it made a choice that set in motion an irreversible economic catastrophe. And that choice was this. Britain decided to pay for World War I not with taxes, but with debt. Massive, unprecedented, economy-destroying debt. Let me paint the picture of Britain before World War I. In 1913, Britain was not just powerful. It was something that had never existed before and has never existed since. Britain controlled more than 400 million people, roughly a quarter of humanity. British companies owned railways on every continent. British banks financed everything from American railroads to Russian industrialization. British ships carried 50% of all global trade. The City of London was not just a financial center, it was the financial center, the only place that truly mattered. But here is what made Britain truly unstoppable: financial credibility. For over a century, Britain had run a tight fiscal ship. The government almost always balanced its books. When Britain did borrow, it always paid back. British government bonds, called gilts, were considered the safest investment in the entire world, safer than gold, safer than land. If you had money and wanted to protect it, you bought British government debt. This credibility gave Britain a superpower that America still uses today: the ability to borrow unlimited amounts of money at incredibly low interest rates. When your government bonds are considered perfectly safe, you can fund anything. You can build the world's largest navy. You can construct a global network of colonies. You can project power to every corner of the earth, all on borrowed money, as long as everyone believes you will pay it back. Then came the summer of 1914. An Austrian archduke was assassinated in a city most British people had never heard of. A series of alliances pulled Europe into war, and Britain had a choice. It could stay out. It could let the continental powers fight among themselves, or it could honor its treaty obligations and join a conflict that had nothing to do with British interests. The British cabinet was divided. Half wanted to stay neutral. They understood that a European war would be catastrophically expensive. They understood that Britain's economy, built on free trade and global commerce, would suffer immensely. But the other half won the argument. Britain entered the war in August 1914, expecting it to be over by Christmas. It lasted 4 years, and those 4 years destroyed Britain's economy in ways that are almost impossible to comprehend. Before the war, Britain's national debt was £650 million. By the end of the war in 1918, it was £7.4 billion. The debt had increased more than tenfold in just 4 years. Britain had borrowed the equivalent of 140% of its entire economy just to fight a single war. But it gets worse. Britain did not just borrow from itself, it borrowed massively from the United States. Before World War I, Britain was the world's largest creditor nation. British investors owned assets all over the world, and everyone owed money to Britain. By 1918, Britain had become a debtor nation. It owed billions to America. The power dynamic had fundamentally reversed. American bankers, who had once looked to London for guidance, now held Britain's financial future in their hands. But British leaders refused to accept this new reality. They kept acting as if Britain was still the world's banker. They kept spending as if the war had never happened. They kept pretending that nothing fundamental had changed. Sound familiar? It should, because America did the exact same thing after 2001. Let me explain. After the September 11th attacks, America launched what it called the War on Terror. 2 decades of continuous warfare in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, and a dozen other countries most Americans cannot even find on a map. And just like Britain in 1914, America decided to pay for these wars not with taxes, but with debt. When America invaded Afghanistan in 2001, the national debt was $5.8 trillion. By the time we finally left Afghanistan in humiliation in 2021, the national debt had reached $28 trillion. The wars themselves cost somewhere between $5 and $8 trillion, depending on how you calculate veterans' benefits and interest payments. But here is what nobody talks about. Just like Britain after World War I, America fundamentally changed from a creditor nation to a debtor nation during these wars. In the year 2000, America still had a trade surplus with much of the world. American manufacturing was wounded, but still functional. The federal government ran a budget surplus. We were paying down debt, not accumulating it. Then came 2 decades of war, 2 decades of tax cuts during wartime, 2 decades of spending money we did not have on conflicts we could not win. And just like Britain after 1918, America emerged from these wars weaker, poorer, and deeply in debt to foreign powers. China now holds over $1 trillion in U.S. government debt. Japan holds another $1 trillion. We are dependent on the continued goodwill of our creditors to keep our government functioning. The parallel is exact. Britain after World War I was dependent on American patience. America after the War on Terror is dependent on Chinese patience. But let me take you back to Britain, because what happened next is the part that should terrify you. After World War I ended, Britain had a choice. It could accept its new reality as a diminished power and adjust its spending accordingly. Or it could try to pretend that nothing had changed and attempt to restore the old order. Britain chose pretension, and that choice killed the empire. In 1925, Winston Churchill, who was Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time, made what economists now consider one of the greatest economic blunders in history. He returned Britain to the gold standard at the pre-war exchange rate. What does this mean in plain English? It means Britain deliberately overvalued its currency to maintain the illusion of strength. The pound was now worth more on paper than Britain's actual economy could support. This had devastating consequences. British exports became too expensive for foreign buyers. British factories could not compete with cheaper American and German products. Unemployment soared. Entire industries collapsed. But British leaders told themselves this was temporary, that the world would adjust, that Britain's reputation alone would carry it through. They were wrong. The 1920s in Britain were not roaring. They were grinding poverty for millions of workers. Industrial cities became wastelands. Coal miners, shipbuilders, factory workers saw their jobs disappear because British products were priced out of global markets. All because the government refused to accept that the pound was no longer worth what it had been before the war. Does this remind you of anything happening right now? It should, because America is doing the exact same thing. We are maintaining a standard of living that our economy can no longer support. We consume far more than we produce. We import everything from China and pay for it with dollars we print. We tell ourselves this can continue forever because the dollar is the world's reserve currency. Just like Britain told itself, the pound would remain dominant forever. But the cracks are already showing. In 2000, the dollar was used in 70% of all international transactions. By 2023, that number had fallen to less than 60% and is dropping every year. China and Russia now conduct almost all their trade in yuan or rubles. The BRICS nations are actively building payment systems that bypass the dollar entirely. Even European allies are quietly preparing alternatives because they see what we refuse to see. The dollar's dominance is not a law of nature. It is a privilege that can be revoked. Let me take you back to Britain one more time, because the final act of this tragedy is the most important. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, Britain kept spending money it did not have on an empire it could no longer afford. Military bases in India, Egypt, Singapore, Hong Kong, East Africa, the Caribbean, everywhere. A navy large enough to patrol all the world's oceans. A colonial administration employing hundreds of thousands of British bureaucrats. All of this cost enormous amounts of money. Money Britain was borrowing, year after year after year. And every year, the debt grew larger. Every year, the interest payments consumed more of the government's budget. Every year, Britain's creditors, especially America, became more impatient. Then came World War II. And this war, unlike the first one, Britain could not afford at all. By 1941, Britain was essentially bankrupt. It could not pay for the weapons, the ships, the planes it needed to survive. Winston Churchill, now Prime Minister, was forced to go begging to America. President Roosevelt created something called Lend-Lease, where America would supply Britain with weapons and supplies in exchange for Britain handing over its remaining gold reserves, its military bases in the Western Hemisphere, and its economic sovereignty. Britain survived the war, but only as an American vassal. The empire that had ruled the world was now dependent on American permission to continue existing. And after the war ended, America made it very clear who was in charge. This brings us back to 1956 and the Suez Crisis, which I mentioned in the opening. But now you understand the context. Suez was not the moment Britain fell. Suez was the moment everyone finally noticed that Britain had already fallen. The empire had been economically dead since 1945. Suez just made it obvious. When President Eisenhower threatened to collapse the pound, he was not making an idle threat. He was pointing out a reality that had been true for over a decade. Britain survived only because America allowed it to survive. The moment America withdrew that support, the game was over. Now let me connect this directly to America's situation today, because the parallels are not just similar, they are identical in every way that matters. Britain's fatal flaw was continuing to spend on global military commitments it could no longer afford. America currently maintains over 750 military bases in more than 80 countries. We spend more on our military than the next 9 countries combined. We are involved in active military operations in Syria, Iraq, Somalia, Yemen, and dozens of other locations. We have troops permanently stationed in Germany, Japan, South Korea, Italy, the United Kingdom, and 100 other places. All of this costs over $800 billion per year, officially. The real number, when you include veterans' benefits, nuclear weapons maintenance, and intelligence agencies, is well over $1 trillion annually. We are doing exactly what Britain did. We are maintaining a global military presence that made sense when we were the world's undisputed economic superpower, but makes no sense now that we are the world's largest debtor nation. Britain's second fatal flaw was refusing to recognize when former colonies and client states no longer needed British protection. America is making the exact same mistake. We still act as if Europe needs American troops to defend against Russia, even though the European Union's combined economy is larger than America's. We still act as if Japan and South Korea cannot defend themselves, even though they are wealthy, technologically advanced nations. We still act as if the Middle East cannot function without American military intervention, even though our interventions have consistently made things worse. Just like Britain in the 1950s, we are clinging to a role that no longer serves our interests, draining our economy to maintain prestige and influence that is rapidly disappearing. Britain's third fatal flaw was the belief that its currency's dominance was permanent. British leaders genuinely could not imagine a world where the pound was not the global reserve currency. They had held that position for so long that it seemed like a law of nature. Even as the evidence mounted that the dollar was replacing the pound, British officials dismissed it as temporary, as an aberration that would correct itself. American leaders today have the exact same blindness. We cannot imagine a world where the dollar is not dominant. We cannot conceive of a scenario where countries refuse to hold dollars, where oil is priced in yuan, where international trade bypasses American banks. It seems impossible. It seems unthinkable. It seemed exactly that way to British officials in 1950. But here is the thing about economic gravity. It does not care what you believe. It only cares about math, and the math for America is catastrophic. Let me show you the numbers that keep me awake at night. America's total national debt is now over $35 trillion. That is more than 120% of our entire economy. We add approximately $2 trillion to that debt every single year. We are borrowing roughly $7 billion every single day just to keep the government operating. The interest payments on this debt now exceed $1 trillion per year. Let me repeat that. We are spending over $1 trillion every year just on interest payments, not on education, not on infrastructure, not on healthcare, just interest, just the cost of servicing debt we accumulated in the past. This is the death spiral. This is exactly where Britain was in 1945. So much debt that an increasing portion of government revenue goes to interest payments, which means less money for everything else, which means more borrowing, which means higher interest payments, which means even less money for everything else. It is a mathematical trap with only one exit: collapse. But it gets worse, much worse, because America, like Britain before it, has made promises it cannot possibly keep. Britain promised its citizens a welfare state, free health care, generous pensions. It could not afford any of it, but politicians kept promising because admitting the truth was political suicide. Those promises eventually contributed to decades of economic stagnation. America has made even bigger promises. Social Security is projected to be insolvent by 2033. Medicare is projected to be insolvent by 2028. These are not predictions. These are mathematical certainties based on current funding levels. When these programs become insolvent, the government will face an impossible choice: cut benefits and face political revolt, or borrow trillions more and accelerate the debt crisis. There is no good option. Britain faced the exact same dilemma in the 1960s and 1970s. They chose to keep borrowing. It led to the British economy becoming the sick man of Europe, requiring an IMF bailout in 1976. The once mighty empire reduced to begging the International Monetary Fund for help, like a developing nation. That is America's future. Not possibly. Not maybe. That is where this ends unless something fundamental changes. Let me tell you about the mechanism of how these collapses actually happen, because this is crucial. Empires do not fall overnight. They fall gradually, then suddenly. For years, sometimes decades, the warning signs are visible to anyone paying attention. The debt accumulates, the currency weakens, the trade deficits grow, foreign powers become more assertive, but because the collapse has not happened yet, people assume it never will. This is called normalcy bias. It is the human tendency to believe that because something has always been a certain way, it will always continue that way. It is the same bias that keeps people living in their homes even when they can hear the hurricane approaching. Britain experienced normalcy bias for 30 years. From 1918 to 1948, British citizens watched their empire slowly crumble. They watched the debt grow. They watched the pound weaken. They watched colonies agitate for independence. They watched American power grow. But because Britain had been dominant for so long, most people assumed it would remain dominant forever, even the smart people, even the experts. Then came Suez, and in 11 days, the illusion shattered completely. Suddenly, everyone could see what had been true for decades. Britain was not a superpower. Britain was a declining power living on borrowed time and borrowed money. America is in that same twilight period right now. We can see the signs if we are willing to look. China's economy is now larger than America's when measured by purchasing power parity. Chinese infrastructure is state-of-the-art, while American infrastructure crumbles. China graduates more engineers every year than America has engineers total. China builds high-speed rail networks while America cannot even repair its existing rail lines. But we tell ourselves comforting stories. We tell ourselves that China's numbers are fake, that their system is inefficient, that they are about to collapse any day now. These are the exact same stories Britain told itself about America in the 1920s and 1930s. American products were supposedly inferior. American culture was supposedly vulgar. American power was supposedly temporary. None of it was true. It was just cope, just denial in the face of obvious reality. Let me tell you what America's Suez moment will look like, because it is coming. It might be in 2026. It might be in 2030. But it is coming, and it will be sudden. Here is one scenario. China invades Taiwan. America threatens sanctions. China responds by dumping its $1 trillion in U.S. Treasury bonds on the open market. The value of the dollar collapses overnight. Interest rates spike to 15%, 20%, maybe higher. The cost of everything imported, which is almost everything, doubles or triples within weeks. The government cannot borrow at these new interest rates, so it has to slash spending immediately. Social Security checks stop. Medicare stops. Federal employees get furloughed. The economy goes into freefall. In this scenario, America faces the same choice Britain faced in Suez: back down or watch your economy burn. And just like Britain, America backs down. We do not defend Taiwan. We accept China's dominance in Asia. We accept the end of the dollar's reserve currency status. We accept that we are no longer the world's policemen. That is one scenario. Here is another, a debt ceiling crisis. Congress plays chicken like it does every few years. But this time, the world does not blink. This time, foreign creditors see that America's political system is so broken it cannot even agree to pay its own debts. Credit rating agencies downgrade U.S. debt to junk status. Interest rates spike. The scenario plays out the same way as the first one: collapse, panic, humiliation. Here is a third scenario. A state like California or Illinois becomes unable to pay its debts. It begs the federal government for a bailout. The federal government, drowning in its own debt, cannot afford the bailout. The state defaults. Panic spreads to other states. Municipal bonds, once considered ultra-safe, become toxic. The financial system freezes. Banks fail. It is 2008 all over again, but this time the government has no credibility left to restore confidence. The specific trigger does not really matter. What matters is that the underlying fragility is already there. The debt is unsustainable. The promises are unfundable. The military is overstretched. The currency's dominance is eroding. All it takes is one crisis, one moment when the world decides that American power is no longer credible, and the whole structure collapses, just like Britain in 1956. Now let me tell you about the aftermath, because this is what really matters. What happens to ordinary people when a reserve currency collapses? When the pound collapsed, British citizens experienced a brutal decline in living standards that lasted for decades. Everything imported became vastly more expensive. Food, fuel, clothing, electronics, everything. Wages did not keep up with inflation. Savings lost value. The comfortable middle-class lifestyle that Britons had taken for granted evaporated. The British economy shrank relative to other nations. Britain went from being the world's workshop to being a manufacturing backwater. Entire industries disappeared. Cities that had been prosperous for centuries became depressed wastelands. Unemployment, especially youth unemployment, reached devastating levels. The brain drain began. The best and brightest British minds emigrated to America, Canada, Australia, anywhere that offered better opportunities. Britain lost a generation of talent because its economy could no longer support them. The same thing will happen in America. When the dollar loses its reserve currency status, every American will feel it immediately. Gas will not be $3 per gallon. It will be $8 per gallon, maybe 10. Groceries will double or triple in price. Electronics, almost all imported, will become luxury items again. The Amazon packages will stop arriving because international shipping becomes too expensive. Your savings, if they are in dollars, will lose half their value or more. Your retirement account will be devastated. Your home's value will collapse because nobody can afford mortgages at 15% interest rates. The American dream of homeownership and comfortable retirement will die for an entire generation. The government will have to make impossible choices. Cut Social Security benefits in half or cut the military in half. There is no option where both continue as they are. The math simply does not work. Unemployment will spike as companies that depend on cheap imports go bankrupt. American manufacturing will not magically return because our infrastructure is outdated and our workforce is not trained for it. We will be stuck in a painful middle ground. Too expensive to import, too broken to produce domestically. Britain's collapse took about 40 years from the start of World War I to the humiliation at Suez. America's collapse has been underway since at least 2001, maybe earlier. We are now 24 years into the process. If history is any guide, we do not have much time left. The signs are everywhere. The debt that cannot be repaid, the infrastructure that cannot be maintained, the industries that cannot compete, the allies who no longer trust us, the rivals who no longer fear us, the currency that is slowly being abandoned. This is not about politics. This is not about left or right. This is about mathematics. This is about historical patterns that repeat across centuries. This is about the inevitable consequence of choices made decades ago finally coming due. Britain's leaders in the 1920s and 1930s had every opportunity to see what was coming. The data was available. The trends were clear, but they chose comfort over truth. They chose pride over pragmatism. They chose to believe their own propaganda. American leaders today are making the exact same choice, and the American people are letting them do it because we, too, prefer comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. But reality does not care about our preferences. History does not care about our feelings. The laws of economics do not bend because we are America. Britain learned this lesson the hardest way possible. In 11 days in November 1956, a 300-year-old empire was brought to its knees by a phone call from its creditor. America's phone call is coming. The only question is whether we will be ready when it does. Subscribe to this channel if you want to understand what is really happening and how to prepare for what is coming, because I promise you, what I have shown you today is just the beginning of the story. The collapse has already started. Most people just have not noticed yet.